One of the areas that is very important to law enforcement is the use of force in making an arrest and in breaking up any sort of violent demonstrations or anything like that. And the Fourth Amendment places restrictions on the use of force. The Supreme Court has said very clearly that excessive force is an unreasonable seizure of a person. So the federal law constrains the degree to which state and local officials can use force, whether it's making an arrest, conducting an investigation. Deadly force can only be used if there's a threat of serious bodily harm or death posed by the defendant. So in the old days, it used to be okay to shoot someone who was fleeing, a fleeing unarmed felon. Any felon could be shot. Today, the Supreme Court has made it very clear that it's not appropriate to use deadly force over someone who's fleeing, who doesn't pose a threat of deadly force or serious bodily harm against anyone else. So it's not appropriate to use deadly force against an unarmed suspect, for example.
The Fourth Amendment regulates searches, which are invasions of privacy, and seizures. And seizures come in two varieties. You can seize property, which interferes with your right of ownership. And seizures can also interfere with your liberty, so that if a police officer restricts you from going to one place or another, that's a Fourth Amendment seizure. And when a police officer uses force, it's an interference with your liberty interest. So, for example, if I'm walking down the street and an officer wants to prevent me from continuing on my way, and the officer grabs me, that's a use of force. That has to be reasonable, and it will be tested under the mandate of the Fourth Amendment. And similarly, if I, have a gun and hold up a bank and I'm running out with the gun in my hand and a police officer yells, "Stop," and I don't stop, and the officer shoots me as I'm running away, once the bullet hits me, that's a seizure also. It's a use of deadly force, and there are rules under the Fourth Amendment about when it's reasonable to use deadly force. And police officers have to be very, very well versed in when they can use deadly force, because that's the most awesome power we give to police officers. Police officers are the only people in the United States government that's given the legitimate authority to use deadly force within the confines of the borders of this country. We allow members of the armed services to use deadly force, but not within the confines of the borders of this country. But we give police officers guns, and we tell them that they have the right to use those guns, but they can only use them when the use of force is reasonable and constitutional.
Citizens will frequently ask, when is use of force warranted and how much force is appropriate? I think it's safe to say that officers can resort to use of force in the face of an imminent threat of bodily injury, particularly significant bodily injury, to another person. And so a police officer does not have to play the rope-a-dope with a person he or she encounters on the street and dodge blows. Similarly, a police officer doesn't have to stand idly while a person poses an imminent threat of bodily harm to another person. The amount or the measure of the force is a little more complicated, so that you will often hear people say, "I don't understand how a police officer could shoot a man for trying to steal property." And in fact, that is correct. You can't. Police officers can't shoot suspects for trying to steal property. But a suspect who is about to come into my home poses a different degree of threat than a suspect who is breaking into my car. The suspect in the first scenario, I would argue, is an appropriate candidate for serious force, if not lethal force. The suspect in the second scenario is not. A suspect fleeing from a police officer who does not pose an imminent threat of harm to the officer is not an appropriate candidate for lethal force. But it's more complicated when that suspect is armed. The officer's chasing the suspect at night, and the officer has to decide whether to pursue the suspect down the alley and hope that the person doesn't turn around and shoot him or her. Well, when you're reviewing these cases and these fact patterns, and it involves a shot to the back, you want to, the instinct, your impulse, is to assume that it's an illegitimate shoot, when in fact it's so much more complicated.
Excessive force claims are a fertile source of civil rights litigation. There are many situations in which the subjects of police investigations or arrest will sue the police officers themselves individually for using excessive force. And those claims are judged under the Fourth Amendment reasonableness standard for the use of force that governs all officials in the United States, both state and local and federal.
An officer's exercise of authority and or power loses its credibility when we as citizens observe it and conclude that it's being exercised capriciously or arbitrarily. If I'm Joe Citizen, the last thing I want to hear from an officer, or what I don't want to sense from a police officer, is that he or she is ramping up force simply because they can. I think the better officers, taking into account the hazards of the encounter, go to great pains to eliminate non-physical encounters, right? So they try to diffuse by talking, reasoning with folks, looking for the equities in the facts that might allow for some sort of understanding or détente between the citizen and the police officer. Contemporary examples of that not happening are in the news all too regularly when you see what appears to be a disproportionate response to an encounter. And the harm that that isolated incident does to the overall presumption that I think we all need to go about our jobs is just immeasurable. You know, an encounter goes viral, and my juries want to second guess the actions of police officers in totally unrelated scenarios, because they now assume that somewhere in the back of that officer's mind in the case before them is the sort of thought that led to the encounter that has gone viral. And I can't imagine what it must be like to be a police officer having to process things in real time, but I know that the better ones figure out non-physical ways to diffuse and interdict.